Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Tent, where political merchants come to trade. Hosted by Circus Bazaar Magazine and produced by Circus Bazaar Productions, where truth is stranger than fiction.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Ich bin ein Berliner.
Join the progressive body. We've had a problem here.
Obviously, being a woman in public life.
An iron curtain has descended across the country.
Hi there, people. Welcome to episode 3 of the Big Tent podcast by Circus Bazaar Productions. Before we get started, and for those who have not yet checked us out, why not go over and visit the historically and politically focused magazine circusbazaar.com. And if you're interested in our more commercially orientated operations, please be sure to visit us at circusbazaarproductions.com. I'll put both links in the podcast description. Today we have another really cool guest, a fellow that has not only scaled the heights of elite academia, but happens to be a certified Olympian. A guy that after his Olympic swimming career made the crazy move to actually swim the English Channel, only to wind up a political dissident in his home country of Singapore. Peoples, enter PJ Thum. PJ is a Rhodes Scholar and a research fellow at the University of Oxford and the coordinator of Project Southeast Asia. He's also the creator and host of the podcast The History of Singapore and the founder of the media startup The New Naratif. The reason I was interested in having PJ on the podcast was twofold. Firstly, Circus Bazaar magazine had previously interviewed and written about several individuals located in Singapore that had come under the wrath of the Singaporean state. This was either for voicing opinions deemed slanderous to political leaders or legally seditious to the state. Having previously had the opportunity to meet PJ, it was a good opportunity to catch up with him. But secondly, and more pertinent to the broader political picture, is that Singapore itself represents a particular political animal. Here you have one of the world's great economic and political success stories, a truly multicultural society that celebrates both free trade and maintains a respectable welfare state and national pension fund. But as some would deem is evident in the prosecution of those that speak out against the government for what would be seen as basic freedoms in most of the Western world, there's always a catch. Some people believe that there's a tragic paradox at the core of the nation-state system and how it relates to democracy, globalization, and the provision of welfare to its people. As the theory goes, if you picture a triangle, try and put one of these elements on each corner. Now, no matter how great a nation believes itself to be, it will only ever be able to embrace only two of these corners. Maybe you can be Denmark with its big democratic welfare state, but struggle with the politics of ethnic diversity that comes with unfettered globalization. Or maybe you can be the United States with all its ethnic and cultural diversity and celebration of democracy, but in the end struggle with the politics of wealth redistribution. And finally, you could be Singapore and bask in the embrace of international capital, ethnic diversity, and provide a first world safety net, but in achieving this, end up with less than some would deem acceptable tolerances for basic democratic institutions. This has special significance for what is happening in many of the Western democracies today. Globalization has brought with it many a great thing, including the ethnic and cultural diversity that many of us cherish, but it has also opened up a giant political chasm that has exposed the fragility of its underpinnings. A chasm that most folk naively cannot accept exists. It's no mere consequence that the populist right has persistently dog-whistled to racism and fueled the flames of division along ethnic lines, and it's no surprise that an increasingly out-of-touch left, in an act of desperation, exaggerates and attempts to politically bankroll every guilt-based grievance they can muster. I think that the paradox inside the paradox here is that regardless of whether or not a polity is at relative peace with itself, there is always an incentive to politically exploit identitarian politics within the domain of these often contradictory forces. PJ being specifically interested in the formation of the Singaporean identity and the fact that Singapore is at the very centre of this paradox makes him an extremely interesting guest to chat to about this and many other topics. So let's roll. PJ Thum? Who is PJ Thum?
Who is PJ Thum? Well, I'm Singaporean. I'm 38. I used to swim for my country. I have a bachelor's degree from Harvard and 3 other degrees from Oxford, various scholarships, Rhodes Scholarship, Commonwealth Scholarship. I'm regarded as a political dissident in my own country. But I self-identify as a historian. That's what I am first and foremost, a historian.
Even in front of being a swimmer?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've kind of transitioned out of, I used to be a swimmer first, but I've left that life behind me now. I'm a historian.
Yeah. Okay, but we can, absolutely discuss history and Singaporean politics, but I really wanted to also speak to you about your swimming career. I mean, it's no mean feat to be an Olympic swimmer. So what's your actual specialty?
Well, I swam the butterfly, and in particular, my event was the 200-meter butterfly. That's what I mainly competed at throughout my career, and that's the event that I used to hold the national record for in Singapore.
Yeah, and then which Olympics did you compete in?
1996 in Atlanta.
And how did you go?
Oh, well, not very well. I mean, I was 16. I was a bit overawed by everything. And, it's terrible jet lag because it was 12 hours time difference. So I think I finished 31st or something like that. I didn't do very well. Yeah. I told myself, oh, I'll come back in 4 years and do better. But then I hurt my knee quite badly in an accident in June of 2000. So I never got to go to another Olympics, Yeah, so it's always been one lesson for me. The opportunity comes for something, take it, because you never know if the opportunity will ever come again.
Okay, but you've swum the English Channel, right?
Yeah, that was
But you
sort of
didn't do that butterfly.
No. I think, as far as I know, only one person has, which is amazing and astonishing to me that someone could do it swimming butterfly.
Yeah, I love swimming, but yeah, the thought of swimming even 500 meters butterfly is a pretty daunting prospect.
Yeah, butterfly is all about timing, right? It's a stroke which, if you think of like how a fish moves, a dolphin moves, or a worm moves, right? It's a sort of sine wave where the front crawl is very much a corkscrew, and the backstroke is also a corkscrew, and the breaststroke is like a paddle boat steamer, right? Or not so much a corkscrew, but a propeller, right? If you think about various forms of propulsion through the water, the fundamental principles behind the front crawl and the backstroke are the propeller. With the breaststroke, it's the paddle boat steamer. But with the butterfly, it's like a sine wave, and so it's technically the most demanding of all the strokes, I think. And it requires the most amount of work to get your timing right. Very timing dependent stroke. Yeah.
So you burn more calories per distance.
I don't know about burning more calories. I think what you need to do is because swimming through the water it's a very difficult thing for the human brain to understand. We're apes, we evolve on land. When you think about propulsion on land, the harder you push on the ground, the faster you move forward. Whereas in the water, right, propulsion is different, and you're moving through a fluid medium. And the harder you push, the resistance from the water increases at a square to your forward, the force you're exerting going forward. So speed in swimming is not just about forward propulsion. It's not just about strength and, producing that power. It's also about reducing resistance, right? And that's why the modern motorboat is faster than the old-fashioned paddle boat steamer, even though those have a huge amount of surface area pushing backwards, whereas a modern propeller is pushing, if you look at how propeller is shaped, is pushing to the side. But because modern boats, and then if you think of racing boats or yachts, right, they literally lift themselves out of the water, right? It's all about reducing resistance as it is about propelling forward. So with the front crawl, it's about moving from lying on your side basically and moving side to side. So like a propeller or a corkscrew. But with the butterfly, you literally want to time your body so that you're moving up and down through the water, which is a very artificial movement that you need to train your brain to get used to, train all your muscles to do. And because it works so differently, your center of gravity is different in the water. You need a lot of, I think, technical training in order to retrain your nervous system, your muscles, to work in a very different way from moving on land. And it actually works both ways, because as I got more and more proficient at the butterfly, I got less and less proficient at moving on land, because my muscles were being retrained to move in a different medium, a fluid medium, to swim like a fish, right, rather than walk like an ape. See, so it's actually, it was very, looking back, it was a very interesting experience in terms of how you transform your body to adapt to your surroundings.
Yeah, I think that anyone that spends a real serious amount of time perfecting a sport, especially something as optimized as one style of swimming, would notice that. Because, I mean, you can look at it. I mean, to the untrained eye, you would look at a boxer versus these MMA fighters, but they're so optimized on their particular metric, even though they're both fighters. I don't think there's been many cases of people being able to successfully transition.
Yeah.
With the butterfly technique, is there a high
agree,
incidence of erosion of your shoulders, for instance?
No. One of the things I'm very proud of is that, unlike a lot of my fellow swimmers, not to run them down, but shoulder injuries are very common in swimming because swimmers are trying to force their bodies into positions which the bodies are not used to, right? And there's a huge amount of stress on the shoulder joint. It's your primary form of propulsion, after all. Your power connecting through your hips into your shoulders, into your hands. And it puts a lot of stress on the shoulder, but I never got a shoulder injury from repetitive stress. And that's because I did a lot of work on my technique, right? And there's a timing. So if you do it right, you shouldn't strain your shoulder.
So what was the training regime like in the Singaporean Olympic team?
Well, we trained separately. Singapore back then had a club-based system, right? So if it's like football, and going to the World Cup. All the players train and compete at different clubs, and then they're selected for the national team. So with Singapore, we trained at the club level, and there were inter-club competitions. And then you'd be selected for the national team. And anyway, swimming's not a team sport, so it really didn't matter whether we, knew each other or had any sort of chemistry. We just got picked for our individual events. So for us swimmers, I think swimming technology, swimming science has changed a lot, right? I look at what swimmers do today, and they are far, far more specialized than what we used to do. And the art of training in swimming, the art of, the technique, that's changed a huge amount. So, I kind of envy swimmers today and the kind of knowledge that they have, and the data, the visualizations, the ability to break down your stroke through all this technology. All these, we didn't have all that. It was the early 90s. And, for us, the height of technology was being able to get a handycam to record you as you swam, and then, watch yourself swim on VCR, and, try and analyze your stroke. So what we did was basically a huge amount of time in the pool, right? 24 hours per week. You're looking at 10, 11 sessions per week in the pool, 2 hours each session. And it would break down into a lot of endurance work, speed work, and technique work. And you do that most days. You do it twice a day. 5 to 7 a.m. head to school, and then after school you do 5 to 7 p.m. And then head home. And then when I went to university later, we'd also add in 3 gym sessions a week. So that was about an hour each. So total, you're looking as much as 27 hours a week, which I think modern, current coaches would see as excessive, right? And the amount of endurance work that we did is actually probably, as I understand it, not seen as necessary nowadays.
Yeah, now they take more of a philosophy of a lot of low intensity technique work and then just 2 or 3 highly intensive sessions per week, right?
Actually, I don't know. I left swimming behind. I retired after the channel and I'm done. I have no idea how swimming is. I have no idea. I have some idea, but I don't know the specifics anymore. I'm not interested, actually.
Yeah. But so this was in 1996, you said?
Yes.
And you were how old?
16.
Okay. And then, so how old were you when you did the English Channel?
25.
Okay,
yeah.
so
We're
that
born
was
the same
in what
year,
year?
aren't we? 79. You're also born in 79,
Yes.
aren't you?
Yep. I'm 39.
Yes. Yes. So my
What
birthday's
a
end
year,
of
huh?
the year. Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
and so what's the distance of the English Channel?
It's 21.8 miles, land miles, point to point, which is around 35 kilometers. But of course, you don't actually swim that little. The distance that you swim is first very dependent on the current. There's a very strong current because all this water in the Atlantic ends up being squeezed into the channel and hitting out into the North Sea. So the current is very, very strong. And it kind of changes direction halfway through. So if you think of swimming from Dover to Calais, right? It's almost as if there are 2 swimming lanes. And the channel, all the shipping in the channel uses those lanes. The current rushes up one way and then turns around the North Sea and rushes down on the other side of the channel. And in between, there's a strip of dead water, which you could think of like as a lane line or something, right? So when you swim, you end up doing a big curve. You swim sort of downwards, pushed by the water, or upwards, depending on which way the current goes, until you hit that dead water in the center. Then you swim almost vertically upwards or downwards down that sort of dead water until you hit a point where you can start heading for France again, and the current will push you towards Calais, towards Cap Grenade, right? And you don't want to miss it, because if you time it wrong and you miss the coast, you could end up swimming a lot further as you're washed way out, beyond the French coast. So it's a very careful, sort of timing that you need to do. So you end up swimming closer to, I think I swam close to something like 56, 58 kilometers in total, actually. But of course, a lot of the way I was pushed, either north or south by the current. So.
Okay, so is it something you'd like to do again? Or is that a one-off and what I'm asking is, was it extremely hard, or was it not as bad as you expected?
Very difficult. I mean, when I look back, it was the closest I've come to dying, I think. I knew it was bad, but it was a whole bunch of things. First of all, I never put on enough weight, right? One of the misconceptions about the channel is that you put on some sort of bodysuit, wetsuit. You're not allowed to do any of that, right? The technology of the channel remains constant. You're only allowed to wear basically what the first crosser wore, and he was a Victorian, Captain Matthew Webb, in 1875. And he wore a wool suit with no arms, no legs, right? Just a sort of, one of those old Victorian sort of, body suits, like a sort of tank top short sort of, combo, and a cap, right? So basically, you're allowed the same thing. Your suit is just trunks, and it can't go more than, mid-thigh. And if you want to cover your body, your shoulders and arms have to be bare, right? You can't wear sleeves. And then you're allowed a pair of goggles, and you're allowed a cap. And that's it, right? You're not allowed to wear a wetsuit. It has to be a standard sort of lycra swimsuit. So it is very, very cold in the channel. It's 16 Celsius. usually when we cross, which is the warmest time of year, your body goes into hypothermia at 36 Celsius. So that gives you an idea of how big the challenge is. And the only way to stay warm is actually your own body fat, because anything you smear on your own body, goose fat or grease or whatever, will eventually wash off in the salt water. So what we're told is just to eat a lot. Just eat a huge amount. And I did my best and I put on a lot of fat, but it was nowhere enough. If you look at people who have crossed the channel multiple times, massive shoulders, but also, a lot of fat on them to protect against the cold, right? It's absolutely necessary. And so I was just shivering. I was very much shivering, even though I trained in Dover Harbor for 2 months before I swam. I was just shivering for most of the way, from about an hour in. And, I think that was the main, just the when you're shivering uncontrollably and you're worried about losing control of your own body, it's a very scary thing. So that was the first thing. The second thing was about 4 hours in, we hit really bad weather. Because when you sign up to swim the channel, you're given a 2-week window, and the pilot that you hire to take you across, right? You follow his boat, and if you can't see France from the water, so you need a boat. Anyone who tries to swim it without a pilot boat almost certainly dies, right? It's almost, I've never heard of anyone succeed without a pilot boat. So the pilot then makes the decision whether to make the attempt. And if the weather is bad for 2 weeks, then that's it. You lose your deposit and you have to wait another year for the channel season, the swimming season to open up again. So because of my speed, my pilot decided to take a risk, and he said there's a 12-hour window of good weather, let's go for it. And normally he wouldn't try it because most people take around 15 hours, but he thought I could do it in around 10, assuming the weather stayed okay. So we decided to go for it, especially since, I had a lot of sponsors and well-wishers and people cheering me on back home in Singapore and around the world. So I didn't want to miss this opportunity. But around 4 hours in, the weather went bad for about an hour. Winds went up to force 5. I had all this salt water dumped on me. The waves were bad. I drank so much salt water, and I didn't think I was going to make it because I was so exhausted after all of that. And I could tell it had a bad impact on my friends on the boat as well, because up to that point in time, they were cheering me on. And then suddenly it went totally quiet from the boat. And I think all of them were just busy throwing up over the side of the boat. So at the end of that, I said to myself, I don't think I'm going to make it. But if I want to get out, if I want to fail, if I want to give up, I still have to swim to the boat, right? I can't just give up in the middle of the channel. I still have to swim to the boat and get out. And if I can swim to the boat, it means that I can still carry on a little bit longer. So I decided what I was going to do is swim to the boat and then reevaluate. But of course, by the time I swam to where the boat was, it had moved on. So at that point where I was reevaluating, I said, well, okay, can I still swim to the boat? And so I swam to the boat, to where the boat now was. And by that time, the boat, of course, had moved on, right? So that's how I began to motivate myself, swim to the boat. And then the distance in my mind that I was trying to talk myself into became shorter and shorter. Swim halfway to the boat, swim a quarter way to the boat, to the point where it became, take one more stroke. Can you take one more stroke? Yes, I can take one more stroke. Okay, I take one more stroke. And my expectation was that at some point, I would ask myself, can I take one more stroke? And my body would say, no, you cannot take one more stroke. And then I'd slowly start to drown. And then I'd hope that the boat would turn around and be able to fish me out before I drowned. And so actually I spent, it took me 12 hours. So I spent around 7 or 8 hours just saying to myself, one more stroke, one more stroke. And the first time I actually realized I was going to do it, that I was actually going to succeed, was when I brought my arm down and I hit sand And I realized, oh, holy shit, I made it. I'm here. I'm on France. And I staggered out of the water. And in my mind, I was like heroically running out of the water. But the news TV crew that went ahead of me and was there on the beach filming me, if you watch the footage of me, I'm actually practically crawling up the beach in so much pain.
Oh, I can imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the footage is still on YouTube if you want to go find it. Yeah,
Maybe we
so,
can link to it in the description.
Oh yeah, put it in the show notes. So you can see me, in my mind, heroically running up the beach, but in reality, like staggering up in pain. And I did the swim on a Saturday, and it wasn't until the next Thursday that I could lift my arms into a sort of horizontal position, right? If you think about your arms and you lift up your arms up off the ground, right, sideways. I couldn't do that until Thursday. Just couldn't, not even horizontally. So that's how much pain I was in.
Yeah. Ouch. And what about your basic condition? How long did it take to recover? I mean, because the stress it puts on your whole nervous system, like your heart and everything. I mean, at what point did you fully recover?
That's an interesting question. Fully recover. I don't know if I've ever fully recovered. I suppose it took me a while. Definitely quite a while. But I had an injury. I collided with with a mooring buoy in Dover Harbor when I was training, right? I was breathing towards the ocean side, and the current was pushing me towards the harbor, and so I didn't see the mooring buoy, and I whacked it with my hand, and I've got nerve damage in my right hand. And so to this day, whenever I'm tired or stressed out, my right hand aches in a specific point where the nerve has died. And if you look at my hands, you can see that there's a sort of crease where the muscles wasted away because the nerve has, So I still carry that sort of scar with me. So I suppose it took me several weeks, months, I don't know, to recover. But physically, the damage, I don't think this will ever go away.
But mentally, you'll hang your hat on it for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And so you were the first Singaporean to swim the channel?
Yes, first, and I think still only.
Okay, and the news crew that was waiting for you at Calais, was it a Singaporean-based news crew?
It was a Channel News Asia, someone filming on behalf of Channel News Asia. She was UK-based, right? And there was also a photographer who was also UK-based. Yeah.
Well, that must have significantly lifted your profile in Singapore.
Oh yeah. I was it was front page news in Singapore, and also I got congratulatory notes from the Prime Minister, and I got to meet the President, who was very nice, very kind.
Yeah, well, it's a huge achievement. And you did this while you were studying at Oxford?
In between. So my second bachelor's degree at Oxford was 2002 to 2004. And then for a short while, I was a school teacher in Singapore. And then I left to go do this. This was in May 2005. I left Singapore and I set up camp in Dover, basically, and trained in the harbor. And I swam in August 2005. And then I started my doctorate. I started my master's, rather, which transitioned straight to a doctorate in October 2005.
Okay. And so what was your doctorate on?
Well, my doctorate was on Singapore history. And specifically, the title is Chinese Language Political Mobilization in Singapore, 1953 to 63. So it's about the Chinese language perspectives on Singapore's decolonization in the 50s. And it addressed a huge gap in our history, in our understanding of history, because Singapore's history is very much written from the perspective of the English-speaking community in Singapore, who formed the colonial elite and then the post-colonial elite. So it was using English language sources and official British documents. But the problem is the vast majority of Singaporeans in the 50s and into the 60s did not speak English. And only 11% of Singaporeans were fluent in English in 1957. So you can't tell the story of a mass movement about decolonization, right, and our independence movement without actually looking at sources that are in the language of the people who participated in that movement. And Chinese is one of the main languages, and Malay is the other main language. So, I looked at Chinese newspapers and Chinese language writing, and I found that the story they told was dramatically different from the English language elite perspective, right? The Chinese were heavily working class laborers, coolies, dock workers, and they had a very, very different, they worked in factories, right? So there was also a class distinction there as well. So it was a very different story, and so that's what my thesis was about.
And you have done a lot of research into controversial historical areas regarding, what is it called? Is it Operation
Cold store, like cold storage, right? Yeah.
And is that related somehow to a believed communist insurgency in Singapore?
Yeah. Oh boy. This is a sort of misconception because my work, all this controversy around my work is on Operation Cold Store, and Operation Cold Store forms a very, very tiny part of my work. My work really is about identity and conceptions of different ideas of post-independence identity, right? When you have a colony in which the vast majority of people are immigrants and they have, their ancestors or they themselves come from elsewhere, but they've decided to make a home here, and now they are going to be independent and decolonized. And then the question then becomes, well, what is the nature of this new nation state, right? How do we create a nation? What are our shared values? What does it mean to be Singaporean or Malayan, as they call it back then? What do all these things mean? And that's what my work explores. But because of this one controversial thing, which is a rather minor point in my work, that there's been so much furore over this, and it's not even original to me, right? So for your audience, right, basically Operation Cold Store was a security action by the colonial government and the elected People's Action Party government in February 1963, in which they arrested over 100, I think it was 113 people over 2 days, and accused these people of being part of a communist conspiracy to violently overthrow or subvert the state. And these 113 people included all the leading opposition politicians in Singapore, the leading trade union activists, the leading trade unionists, political activists, student leaders. Anyone who opposed the government basically was arrested and locked up. And this completely destroyed the political opposition in Singapore. And then subsequent uses of this, the law, detention without trial, right, have systematically dismantled and destroyed opposition politics in Singapore, right, allowing the People's Action Party to then proceed to independence unchallenged. And from there, they have ruled Singapore pretty much unchallenged for the last 60 years. So the government accused these people of being part of a communist conspiracy and detained them without trial. And some of the people detained were detained without trial for decades. And none of them were ever charged in open court on the charges that they were detained under. And what other academics have argued, and it was their work that I built on, is that these detentions were for political reasons, not security ones. That really it was the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who abused this law to rid himself of his political opponents, and in the context of the Cold War, blaming communism and using that as an excuse for eliminating his political opposition. And of course, the British were happy to go along with it because Lee Kuan Yew was seen as a generally reliable pro-British political ally. And the British had a lot of key interests in Singapore, including their military base, their port, and all the financial investments and trading companies that existed in Singapore. So this by pointing out that Operation Cold Store was conducted for political reasons, it undermines the People's Action Party narrative that they took these actions to destroy a genuine security threat. And that's the same rationale that they've used in the decades since to lock up around 2,500 people between 1963 and 1988 without trial, right? And none of them were ever charged. And the longest person was detained for 32 years without ever being charged. So it heavily undermines a central plank of the People's Action Party's legitimacy and its own narrative about how it came to power and how it saved Singapore from what it calls, from becoming communist. And I suppose that's why it's so controversial. Yeah.
But it also forms, from their perspective, a key pillar of the historical narrative and therefore the collective identity of Singapore, yeah?
Yes. I mean, it's not unique to them, of course, in the sense that many governments use fear, right? The sense of external enemies, an argument that the nation state is beset by enemies from within and without, to then pass draconian legislation and use that legislation to then further their own control, their own political control, and for their own benefit. And the People's Action Party is no different in that regard.
But all countries have an ethnic makeup. I mean, do you think Singapore is to what extent is it necessary for the Singaporean government to have held a firm hand in a country that was being essentially built from the ground up, that was of a truly multi-ethnic character?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think, first of all, this idea that Singapore was built from the ground up is kind of problematic, because we have to remember that by the 1930s, Singapore was already the richest country in Asia, right? It was extremely prosperous, extremely rich. It had, by the 1950s, again, after the war, right? It had the highest average income in Asia. The only place in Asia richer was Tokyo, right? Which is a city, not a country. Singapore had, many of the things which they're famous for today: tall buildings, wide boulevards, clean drinking water, beautiful infrastructure. And the reason why there was still a lot of suffering in Singapore was colonial exploitation. You had a tiny class of extremely ultra-rich, and then the majority of the population lived in general squalor. So it's not that Singapore was poor and then the PAP made it rich. And it wasn't that they were building Singapore from the ground up, so to speak. It was that Singapore suffered from massive inequality, and a socialist government was elected, a socialist party was elected into government to address these problems of massive inequality and discrimination and colonial exploitation, which they did very successfully into the 1970s and into, and all the policies that we think of today as making Singapore successful are actually very much social welfare policies that were designed to benefit the majority of the population and to equalize opportunity. So that's the first thing, right? And now the second thing is that I think Singapore in general had a pretty stable multi-ethnic arrangement even before the PAP. We are a country that, for a bunch of historical reasons, we don't have a hereditary monarchy, and we don't have an existing traditional social elite, right? So as a port, a completely urban, heavily urbanized, heavily industrialized city-state, we have a very different makeup to a lot of other countries, which include, very different urban and rural areas, which may have more traditional hierarchies. Instead, Singapore, over the course of its first 150 years, evolved very much as a sort of frontier port city where wealth was the biggest determinant of social standing. And so the management of those relationships was very much left to each community to handle internally. And it was only after the war that then the British embarked on massive social engineering to try and create a unified sense of national identity, which I would argue the people of Singapore actually, they rejected the British version of national identity, but then embraced this idea that we need to redefine our identity and build a new collective national identity with independence coming, with post-colonialism coming. And what the PAP did was it recognized that these very strong institutions that were evolving dynamically from within the communities were also a threat to the PAP's power, right? Especially Chinese education and Chinese institutions, Chinese organizations, because the Chinese community had the most of the wealth and the majority of the population. So very much in the guise of managing this multi-ethnicity, the PAP then sought to destroy a lot of these alternative organizations which had which could form the base for opposition or resistance to PAP rule. So when we talk about Singapore and its management of our heavily multi-ethnic population, it's hard to disentangle it from the fact that many of the organizations which managed these different communities and which represented these multi-ethnic communities and which organically grew from these communities were destroyed for political reasons, and that the PAP has since used and abused this its management of ethnicity, of race, of religion to further its own political power, while excusing this as being necessary to maintain religious and racial harmony. Right, so it's a complex situation here.
Yeah, so you're arguing that the existing government's been exploiting the politics of division rather than necessarily being forced to use a heavy hand in the state building process.
Oh yeah. It's one point I always make is that Singapore has never ever had a racial riot, and the government claims that we have, but we've never actually had a racial riot. We've had plenty of political riots, and we've had political riots which use race as an excuse, but they were clearly motivated for political reasons. And here's an example, right? The government loves to say that in 1964 we had 2 race riots, and that is why we have to heavily manage, right? Why they take such a heavy-handed approach to race in Singapore. But the fact is, right, to call them race riots contradicts the government's own explanation for those riots. After the riots happened, the government insisted that they were actually political riots caused by agents provocateur from Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia. Right? Back then, Singapore was part of Malaysia, and the PAP, as the state government of Singapore, was seeking to take their party national, and the government in Kuala Lumpur obviously did not want the PAP to go national, but to stay in Singapore, and the fight between them became extremely vicious, and both sides started using all sorts of very inflammatory rhetoric, including race. So when the riots broke out in Singapore on the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, a street procession turned violent, the PAP actually blamed politics, not race. And that was the official explanation. And from what we understand, that was the official explanation given by the Singapore government to the subsequent Commission of Inquiry, which sat in Kuala Lumpur, whose findings remain classified to this day, right? And the PAP held that line all the way until the late 90s, by which time the threat of Malaysia and the sort of politics of the situation had changed. And the PAP instead wanted to, because they had suffered electoral reverses in the early 90s, they wanted to institute a new system of national education, as they called it, to instill a lot of these ideas of, basically to instill the government line, the government's values, the sort of PAP version of history into the school-going population. And so suddenly, in 1997, they declared that, these riots were actually caused by racial issues, and they declared the anniversary of the riots to be Racial Harmony Day. But of course, if they were really caused by racial issues and, necessitated that kind of treatment, why didn't they do that in 1964 or 65? Why wait until 1997, right? So the explanation is quite clearly tied into the fact that the PAP had lost an then unprecedented 4 seats in the past election, and felt that they were losing control of the population, and so wanted to push a far more, a certain version of history which justified their heavy-handedness and justified their authoritarianism. So, again, it's all tied up with politics.
But it's an extremely interesting topic, isn't it? That Singapore had a pre-existing national character defined by sort of open trade rather than the multi-ethnic model that the PAP would like to, I guess what you're saying is, exaggerate their role in creating. It wasn't that long ago that I had a pretty long conversation with a Wall Street Journal journalist who had worked in Singapore, and we discussed a number of things related to the suppression of freedom of speech. And he argued that what existed in the Singaporean political elite was a great sense of pride and achievement over bringing cohesion to Singapore. And that was one of the reasons they were so sensitive, and it had a lot to do with sort of Asian values of respect for leaders and elders and whatnot. Okay. But I guess what you're saying is your narrative very much contradicts their role in creating a national character.
I was with the guy, what this journalist was saying, until he mentioned Asian values. Right? Asian values is such a myth. It's almost insulting, right? That to think that Asians somehow we're more respectful and deferential. I mean, who are the greatest heroes in Asia? Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary. Gandhi, the symbol of non-violent resistance, right? Who do we respect most in Southeast Asia? Revolutionary leaders: Sukarno, Ho Chi Minh, Jose Rizal, right? Tunku Abdul Rahman. If Lee Kuan Yew was so respectful of authority, why aren't we still a British colony? It's this very convenient narrative where former revolutionary governments transition into middle age and become conservative and want to defend their power, and suddenly they start saying, Asians actually very respectful, very deferential. We value society above the individual. And then you point out that these same men who are insisting on Asian values today, when they were in their 20s, were railing at the government, were leading movements to overthrow the government. They were firebrands, they were revolutionaries. What happened to them? The answer is they got old and they just want to stay in power, and they want people to stop disagreeing with them and arguing with them, and they want to quash all dissent. Right? It's this whole Asian values discourse is utterly ridiculous. And I think most governments realize, if you look around the region today, the countries which are doing the best, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, for example, Malaysia is, has just thrown out its government, right? Hong Kong, very strong resistance to Beijing there. There's plenty of a history of resistance and revolution. We just celebrated the anniversary of martial law in the Philippines, right? They threw out Marcos. Where's the deference there, right? So it's this, that this whole discourse is, I find, not just insulting, it's just ludicrous. So that's one thing. All right, but to go to what the first half of what the journalist, your journalist acquaintance was saying, right? I think, yes, the government has a very strong belief that they have created, this country and set it up in a certain way, that there's all this cohesion, that they've got all these gains that must be defended. The problem is, I feel that they genuinely believe it to a great extent, right? But it's very much tied up first with their own self-interest, right, of maintaining themselves in power. And second of all, that they don't have a real sense, in their ivory towers, of what is actually happening on the ground. And that relates to all the censorship in Singapore, that relates to all the fear in Singapore, the authoritarianism in Singapore, right? I think the first generation of People's Action Party leaders knew that all this discourse was political, right? They understood that what they were doing was for political reasons, and they had a much clearer-eyed sense of how things were on the other side, because they had just come from there. Even though they were elites in society, they knew what it was like to be discriminated against, to be non-white in a European colonial society, right? But what we have now is a third generation of leaders who've grown up knowing nothing but power and privilege, who are deferred to at every turn, who have been told from a young age that they are part of the elite, who have been given so many resources and advantages. Read Michael Barr's work about how there's a narrow, self-perpetuating elite in Singapore, and he's got a lot of fantastic data in there showing just how narrow and tiny this elite is, and just how much intermarriage and, familial relationships there are within this elite, right? And the problem is that they believe that they are actually a meritocratically produced elite who have to defend this very fragile system. I don't think they have a clear sense of how the other 99% of us actually live, or the struggles that we have, or the impact of their policies on us, and how these, or the fact that what they say was originally created by, the kind of rhetoric that they use was originally created by politicians 50 years ago as a convenience, to justify a certain policy, to argue for a certain political point at the time. But because of the strength of the People's Action Party government and the strength of the state, this rhetoric somehow now has become hard-coded in to become a sacred cow which cannot be slaughtered, right? To become a sacred truth which cannot be questioned. And that is the real danger. The fact that the elite actually believe a lot of this.
The topic of dynastic politics in Singapore is a real troublemaker, isn't it? I mean, not many people know this, but I know the New York Times has had to pay the Singaporean government significant amounts of money due to perceived defamation just by mentioning dynastic politics in Singapore in the same article as, say, general discussions about the Bush family or the Clintons?
It is definitely, I mean, the government, especially our politicians, love to use defamation suits, I think, to, silence people who disagree with them. And that is it's a very tricky subject, right? But again, if you look at Michael Barr and his book, he lays out a lot of facts which are very clear about the path to power that Lee Hsien Loong had, right? And, I think you should put a link to his book, The Ruling Elite of Singapore, in the show notes, because people who want to understand meritocracy or the lack thereof in Singapore should take a look at that book. But to generalize the section that summarize the section that he wrote on Lee Hsien Loong, Lee Hsien Loong has benefited from a lot of state programs and schemes which all happen to have been started at the very same time that Lee Hsien Loong just became eligible for them, right? And this includes the President's Scholarship, the Singapore Armed Forces Scholarship, a specialized officer training program in the SAF, scholarships to the Kennedy School, and his transition from being in the, serving in the military and civil service to becoming a PAP MP. All of these were, basically state resources were used to create these programs, which he then qualified for straight away. And in one case, he actually, I think it was the President's Scholarship, he actually wouldn't have been eligible because he graduated from, he did his A-levels, and I think he got straight A's or something. He's still a smart man. But he had gotten his A-levels and graduated, and then unexpectedly decided to go back to school and repeat his second year, and nobody knew why. And then partway through the year, the government announced, there's this new scholarship scheme called the President's Scholarship, and only people who are the first eligible group of people are the people who are currently about to sit for their A-levels. And I mean, the timing is very convenient, put it that way. Yeah.
So back to the politics of identity and multi-ethnic society in Singapore, it seems to me that I've got a little pet project that I'm working on in a documentary, which is sort of based around the concept of the globalization paradox, where you would have a triangle where you could say there's democracy, national self-determination, and hyper-globalization on each corner of the triangle. And modern Western countries have a choice. They can sort of have two, but struggle to have three. So right. I've looked at Singapore as somewhat a model in which Western countries, to some extent, look at emulating as the Western countries grow more divisive in their politics. And I don't think I'll find many people to argue with me over the fact that Western society is becoming more fractionalized and re-tribalized to some extent, whether it's over race or gender or sexual identity.
Right.
And I can't help but feel that looking at Singapore is an interesting way to get some context to this. And you're Western educated. Well, Singapore's a Western country to an extent.
Yes.
But
you're absolutely right.
But what I mean is you're educated in the UK, and I'm talking more Euro-Anglo centric here. But if you identify the history of national identity in Singapore away from the multi-ethnic society, that changes the whole terms of this conversation. So, I mean, how do you feel about that paradox?
Well, you see, it's only a paradox. So it's only, you only think that Singapore has a successful model if I think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Singapore works, right? In a nutshell, these tribalizations, these fractures, these divisions have an impact on governments because these governments are responsive to the people, right? And in order to get elected, what you see are political parties arising or political parties shifting to respond to all these this hyper tribalization, these fractures, people shifting heavily to the right, to the left, people pandering, or they might say serving these new very fractured identities and becoming very niche in that sense. And this then fractures the politics in response to the fractures of the society, right? The thing about Singapore is we're not a democracy, and that's why these issues don't appear to affect our politics. We're a repressive authoritarian country in which we don't have free and fair elections. If you don't have free and fair elections, the government doesn't have to then respond to the people's concerns, the people's needs. If you live in Singapore, right, you can clearly see that the forces which are tearing apart or straining Western societies are also present here. The responses to globalization, they're very much here as well. The growing inequality, right? The exploitation of unskilled and semi-skilled workers by globalization. All of this is here. But the government doesn't have to worry about that because we don't have free and fair elections, and also because how our government is set up is that they have a close alliance with international capital, right? The Singapore government's sort of but its performance legitimacy centers on economic growth. And it took a political decision very early on. Lee Kuan Yew and his old guard of ministers, right? Goh Keng Swee, Toh Chin Chye, Ong Pang Boon, Rajaratnam, they decided early on that they would invite foreign capital in to invest in Singapore and to play a major role in its development, while slowly decreasing the significance and role of a local capitalist class. And this was also for political reasons, because that local capitalist class was far more sympathetic to the political opposition, which I was discussing earlier. And these were heavily Chinese speaking merchants and traders, right? So by decreasing the size of the local capitalist class, they undercut the ability again of a sort of organizational base, a source of organizational funding for political opposition. And by allying themselves with foreign capital, they then also gained a powerful set of allies, especially in the context of the Cold War. So that's the situation that Singapore is in right now, right? And that also explains why government is so heavily focused on GDP growth as its metric. Because by increasing foreign investment, by making Singapore attractive to foreign capital, right? By making Singapore more globalized, by easing the barriers to trade, foreign direct investment, that then feeds it increases the metric which the government measures itself by. And all it has to do is win an election every 4 or 5 years to justify its legitimacy. And then it argues that by winning the election, it can do whatever it wants and it can operate a very heavy hand, which again, we've discussed earlier on all sorts of fault lines and fractures. But of course, the elections themselves are extremely unfair in Singapore, right? The rules are very, very much tilted towards the government. And, we can go into this in detail, but suffice to say that, there is, between the fact that the elections are so heavily slanted, that there's so much fear, that there is a dearth of people brave enough to step forward and run for office to begin with, right? That the media coverage, the media is all government controlled, so the media coverage extremely unfair, the financing extremely unfair, resources extremely, it's all slanted to the government. So those elections, it's a foregone conclusion, right? So to come back to your point, the tensions are not reflected in electoral outcomes. and the government does not need then to move to the right or to the left or whatever, in order to win the election. And that's why, these forces that you're talking about don't affect Singapore, because the government is able to maintain such tight control, and there's no alternatives to it. So it's I think Singapore still fits in with this model that we're talking about, and all the tensions still affect us. Just can't see it.
Well, it certainly embraces hyperglobalization. It's definitely got national self-determination, but the democracy part of it is extremely questionable. And you do have a parliamentary system, but then you have something really interesting called OB markers. Would you like to just explain a little bit more what OB markers are?
Well, it's fundamentally a golf term, which I think our second Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, came up with, right? As someone who likes to play golf. And basically, it's this vague idea of extremely arbitrary boundaries that police the limits of our free speech, of our behavior, of what we can say or do in Singapore. But the problem is, right, we don't know where those lines are. They are moved all the time. They're extremely arbitrary. They're where the government says they are, and you only find out after the fact. So it's basically a way of policing us. It's become a shorthand. I think most of us in Singapore use it kind of derisively to refer to the government's arbitrary nature of simply declaring things to be somehow existential dangers to the state or to the society or to the nation.
It's something that I'd really like to introduce into the discourse in my own countries. And this is how Singapore has traditionally dealt with people that speak out against the state. So not so long ago, I actually interviewed an individual by the name of Roy Nung, and I'm very familiar with the case of Amos Yee. Now, I don't agree with their positions on everything, but it's my view that in a society you have a stratification of education in the way that you can confront one's personal feelings towards the state. Now, not everyone has the academic tools to criticize the state on legally acceptable grounds, grounds in which the Singaporean state would expect. So it seems to me that the Singaporean government exploits the disadvantages of people that may simply want to speak out on their own personal feelings using these laws or using these tactics. So you're familiar with the cases of Amos Yee and Roy Nung and the Australian girl that was in prison for 12 months?
I Takagi, I think her name is. Yeah, I mean, I know of the cases. And I think there was a Human Rights Watch report just earlier this year, or maybe end of last year, which basically described the government's strategy for suppressing dissent as killing a chicken to scare the monkeys. And every so often, the government will crack down very heavily on someone, and that then discourages other people from speaking out, right? And that seems, Amos Yee, Roy Nung, those fit in well with that strategy. Ai Takagi and her website, the Real Singapore, because in those cases, they could point to something that was genuinely objectionable, and use that as an excuse to then really crack down on those cases. So, it's I think it's part of the broader strategy. Whereas the government does not use this very same heavy-handed approach, I think, to people who have the capacity and the ability to defend themselves in a more sophisticated or skilled way.
Yeah. But Amos Yee's been given refugee status in the United States, hasn't he? Yes. That's incredible.
I mean, I agree with you that especially in Trump's America, who seems very hostile to refugees, but Amos Yee has been granted refugee status in the U.S. And I think it shows the excessive nature of oppression in Singapore, that it's quite clear to other people when you examine how things are done in Singapore, and the nature of government oppression here, that there really is a genuine threat to freedom of speech, and freedom of expression in Singapore.
Do you think that there's a want in some sections of the upper political classes in Western society that would like to emulate some aspects of the Singaporean model?
I think people want answers, right? That there are major problems in the world facing us, and we desire, especially we really hope that there are straightforward answers that we can apply, and we're looking around trying to learn from each other. And I appreciate that, and I'm very glad that people feel that Singapore, right, which not so long ago was a colony, now has something to contribute, and new perspectives, new ways of doing things. But at the same time, every time I examine this idea, when a Western or a first world commentator looks at Singapore and says we should be like Singapore, they also fundamentally misunderstand or have misconceptions about the nature of life in Singapore, right? And the number one problem is always that they don't understand that just how much control the government is able to exert in Singapore, and that we don't have free and fair elections. So the government doesn't need to be representative of people's genuine concerns, and you can't get away with that in any country which has any sort of democratic election. You just couldn't do that.
See, the paradox inside the paradox here is that if the Western nations do move towards a more fractionalized polity, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the fact that the people themselves feel more divided, because the political class will propagate the idea of division to gain power as well.
Yeah.
So you're saying essentially that's the phenomenon that's existed in Singapore.
Wait, come again?
I said, essentially you're saying that that is the phenomenon that may have happened to an extent in Singapore.
Wait, but your question was that the political class is using...
I'll repeat it all again.
Well, I mean, it seems... Okay, so let me just repeat it, and then you can tell me if I've got it right or wrong. It sounds like what you're saying is that the political class is using these divisions and thereby spreading them, right? Using these divisions for political gain and thereby spreading them.
Well, basically what I'm saying is that the paradox in relation to globalization is that as you introduce more ethnic difference into society, that you would therefore potentially require less democratic institutions to manage that. But this doesn't necessarily have to be a consequence of divisiveness among the people themselves, but can be brought about from the political elite that would then introduce division as a way of obtaining power, which is actually how I see Western society at the moment. I think you have the political right are playing on ethnic nationalism, or the divisive politics of ethnic nationalism further. And on the left, you have basically the same phenomenon, but they're dividing people along lines of gender and sexual preference and actually whatever else they can come up with.
Well, I think it depends, right? Because the reason why those parties, why those parties are propagating fractures is to motivate a core group of voters to win elections which are generally free and generally fair. And in Singapore, the government has gone past that because or rather the government never needed to do that because it already had as a legacy of colonialism, parting gift from the British, it had complete control. So it uses those fractures, whether they're genuine fractures or not. It only needs to, and here is where I agree with you. It creates the idea of those fractures in society as a way of furthering its own control and justifying authoritarianism. Whether or not, the sort of, to use a shorthand, Western countries, I don't think they go in that direction, because the fundamental difference is the elections themselves, right? That Singapore doesn't have free and fair elections, free but unfair elections, right? We have free but unfair elections, but political parties in democratic countries need to win elections. So what they then, past the election, what they then could do to manage these ideas of divisiveness is then to introduce undemocratic or authoritarian strategies, methods, institutions, techniques. But then would that then jeopardize their ability to hold on and stay in power? Because it's a double-edged sword that they are wielding there, right? To get in power, you be divisive, but you can't govern in a divisive manner, because it makes it very, very hard for you then to effect genuine change if the rest of the country is resisting and refusing to work with you. So again, in Singapore, there isn't that problem. So I agree partially with what you're saying, but I think Singapore, again, it comes back to the issue of that the people in Singapore don't have sovereignty over our own lives to the degree that the West does, right? And I would argue that a lot of the problem in the West is due to a deficit in popular sovereignty, and in the ability of people to have agency and self-determination over their own lives, and which is in tension with how globalization is currently structured and how it affects their lives. And Singapore, it doesn't offer a model for the West, because we have national sovereignty but not individual sovereignty, and so people cannot resist.
Okay, PJ. Well, look, that's been a really fantastic discussion, and you're our third guest, but in the future we can maybe do this again when
oh yeah, sure.
So you have a Twitter account and your podcast is available, The History of Singapore?
Yeah, I have a Twitter account. I don't use it much. It's at PJ Thum, PJ Thum. On Facebook as well, facebook.com/PJTHUM. That's my main sort of social media. The podcast can be found at thehistoryofsingapore.com, and my company, my media startup, can be found at newnaratif.com, NEWNARATIF.com.
Okay. Well, like I said before, thank you very much for coming on the show, and we will talk again soon.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for having me on the show.